It did not happen in a ring. There were no opponents to defeat. What surrounded Bruce Lee that day was quieter and more persistent. Doubt. It came from people who believed they understood ability because they could measure it. People who trusted credentials, appearances, and categories. They did not raise their voices. They did not issue challenges. They simply waited. Less than 30 seconds later, no one asked another question, not because they were convinced, but because the debate no longer made sense. Bruce Lee did not defend himself. He did not explain what had changed. He left that to the silence. The room was built for discussion, not demonstration. Tables were arranged to face one another, not an audience. Papers rested neatly at their edges, ashtrays, notebooks, cups left half-finished, small signs of familiarity. This was a place where conclusions were usually reached through conversation, not movement. Most of the people present had worked together before. They shared a vocabulary shaped by training halls, film sets, academic credentials, and professional hierarchies. They did not agree on everything, but they agreed on how authority usually revealed itself. Experience spoke first. Titles followed. Evidence came last. Bruce Lee entered quietly as he often did. There was no pause in conversation when he arrived, only a brief adjustment in tone. Some voices softened. Others continued without acknowledgement, not out of disrespect, but out of certainty. Certainty that the framework of the room did not require his input. He took a seat without ceremony. From the outside, nothing marked him as central to what was about to happen. He carried no documents. He did not bring equipment. He did not announce his presence through posture or expression. To an unfamiliar eye, he might have seemed slightly out of place, not because he lacked confidence, but because he did not signal for attention. The discussion continued. They spoke about capability in abstract terms, about what translated to screen and what did not, about credibility, about the difference between appearance and substance. Names were mentioned, not as challenges, but as references, benchmarks, comparisons that had already been agreed upon before Bruce Lee ever entered the room. No one addressed him directly, yet everything circled him. He listened without interruption. His expression did not tighten when assumptions surfaced. He did not correct inaccuracies. He did not lean forward to interject. His stillness suggested neither agreement nor resistance, only presence. This unsettled no one at first. In rooms like this, silence was often mistaken for concession. What the others did not yet recognize was that Bruce Lee was not waiting for permission to speak. He was observing the structure of the doubt itself, where it came from, how it sustained itself, what it relied on to exist. The certainty in the room was not aggressive. It was comfortable. And because it was comfortable, it felt unassailable. That comfort allowed the discussion to continue without self-examination. The assumptions hardened as they were repeated, gaining legitimacy through calm delivery rather than scrutiny. Bruce Lee remained outside that cycle. He did not position himself against the certainty in the room. He allowed it to stand fully formed, unchallenged, complete. Only then could it be addressed. Only then could it be rendered unnecessary. At this stage, no one felt tension. There was no sense that anything needed resolution. The debate had not yet reached a point where proof was required. But Bruce Lee understood something the room did not yet need to know. Certainty, when left uninterrupted, eventually asks to be tested. And when it does, words are no longer sufficient. The doubt did not announce itself. It moved quietly through the room, carried in tone rather than language, in the way questions were framed to avoid offense, in the pauses that followed certain statements, in what was left unsaid. No one challenged Bruce Lee directly. There was no invitation to defend his approach, no request for clarification. That absence was deliberate, though not consciously so. To ask would have elevated him into the center of the discussion. To remain silent kept the hierarchy intact. The conversation continued around him, not with him. They spoke about standards, about consistency, about what could be relied upon under pressure. The words were neutral, even reasonable, but the direction was clear. Doubt expressed itself through exclusion rather than attack. Bruce Lee remained attentive. He did not withdraw, nor did he assert himself. His gaze moved slowly, taking in the rhythm of the discussion. The confidence with which conclusions were reached, the ease with which assumptions replaced inquiry. He understood this pattern. In environments governed by expertise, doubt rarely takes the form of hostility. It prefers subtlety. It operates through omission, through the quiet agreement of those who believe the conversation has already moved past the need for demonstration. When someone finally acknowledged him, it was indirect. A remark about styles that work better on camera. A suggestion that some abilities were difficult to verify outside controlled settings. No name was mentioned, but the reference landed where it was intended. Bruce Lee did not react. There was no visible tightening of his jaw, no shift in posture. His stillness was not defensive, it was patient. He allowed the implication to exist without contest. This further reinforced the doubt. For those observing, his silence confirmed what they already believed, that if something could not be articulated in their terms, it likely did not apply. That restraint was an absence rather than a choice. What they did not consider was that Bruce Lee was not absorbing their skepticism. He was mapping it. He noted where it originated, how it was reinforced, and, most importantly, what conditions would dissolve it. Doubt, he understood, did not collapse under argument. It collapsed when its assumptions were rendered irrelevant. Still, he said nothing. The absence of confrontation allowed the room to grow more comfortable in its conclusions. The doubt settled in, unchallenged, shared by those who had not examined it closely, but trusted the consensus. In that comfort, the conversation edged closer to its own limitation. Because when doubt exists without opposition, it eventually demands resolution, not through debate, but through demonstration. And Bruce Lee, having identified the shape of the doubt, waited for the moment when it would no longer sustain itself on words alone. The discussion began to narrow. What had started as a broad exchange of ideas slowly tightened around a familiar point. Proof. Not demanded openly, but implied. The kind of proof that fit within existing structures. The kind that could be observed, categorized, and quietly agreed upon. No one framed it as a challenge. Instead, someone posed a question to the room, general, almost academic, about how one might verify certain claims without relying on anecdote. Others responded with measured agreement. The tone remained courteous, even thoughtful. Bruce Lee was not addressed, and yet the direction of the conversation made his presence increasingly unavoidable. He listened as the parameters of verification were outlined. Time constraints, environmental control, repeatability. Nothing unreasonable, nothing overtly exclusionary. Each condition sounded fair in isolation. Together, they formed a boundary. Within that boundary, some forms of ability thrived. Others disappeared. Bruce Lee did not contest the boundary. He did not argue for exceptions. He did not suggest alternate criteria. To do so would have been to enter the debate on terms that already excluded him. Instead, he waited. Those closest to him noticed his stillness. It was not passive. It carried an attentiveness that felt deliberate, as though he were allowing the conversation to complete itself before responding, if response would even be necessary. The debate reached a point of saturation. The same ideas began to cycle back, restated with slight variation. Consensus formed without resistance, not because it had been proven, but because nothing opposed it. That was when the room shifted, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to register. A pause followed a comment, longer than expected. Someone glanced toward Bruce Lee, then away. Another did the same. The possibility of his involvement, long deferred, finally surfaced. Still, no one spoke his name. The argument had exhausted itself without becoming one. There was no tension to resolve, no positions to defend. The conversation had arrived at its conclusion quietly, confident in its own completeness. Bruce Lee recognized the moment. He understood that any verbal contribution now would feel supplemental, unnecessary. The debate, as structured, could not accommodate what he would have said, so he did not speak. Instead, he stood. The movement was unhurried. It did not interrupt anyone mid-sentence. There was no announcement of intent. He rose as though responding to a practical need rather than making a point. The room noticed, not because the action was assertive, but because it did not belong to the conversational rhythm that had governed everything until then. The debate had ended. What followed would not be an argument, and it would not require agreement. Bruce Lee did not ask for permission. He also did not announce what he was about to do. He moved with the same economy that had marked his listening. No haste, no hesitation. The object he approached was ordinary, already present in the room. Something used moments earlier to illustrate a point. It had not been placed there as a test, nor as an invitation. It simply existed within the agreed framework. Bruce Lee positioned himself near it without drawing attention. There was no shift in posture meant to signal readiness, no preparatory motion that suggested effort. He did not face the room. He did not check to see who was watching. What followed lasted less than 30 seconds. There was no display of speed, no visible exertion, no sound to punctuate the moment. His movement was contained, almost indistinct, easy to miss if one had looked away. The object responded as objects do. It did not resist dramatically, it did not fail, it did not demand explanation. Yet something in the room recalibrated. Those who had been mid-thought found themselves pausing, not because the action was impressive, but because it resolved a question they had not realized they were asking. Bruce Lee did not hold the moment. He did not repeat the action to emphasize it. He did not invite inspection or commentary. As soon as it was complete, he stepped back, returning the object to its original state, or close enough that the difference could not be immediately described. From the outside, it might have seemed that nothing had changed, but the debate no longer applied. The conditions that had sustained the earlier doubt were still present. The room, the people, the assumptions, they remained intact. What had shifted was subtler. The framework through which those assumptions operated no longer fit what had just been observed. Bruce Lee said nothing. He did not look for acknowledgement. He did not wait for reaction. The action had not been performed for the room. It had been performed within it, precisely enough that it could not be dismissed, briefly enough that it could not be analyzed in real time. The silence that followed was not confusion. It was adjustment. And in that adjustment, the purpose of the action became clear, not as persuasion, but as closure. The debate had not been answered. It had been made unnecessary. No one responded immediately. The room did not erupt into questions, nor did it retreat into polite acknowledgement. What followed was a pause without instruction, a silence that had not been requested, but was now unavoidable. People looked at the object Bruce Lee had interacted with, then at one another, then back again. No one suggested repeating the action. There was nothing to repeat. The discussion that had occupied the room moments earlier did not resume. Not because it had been disproven, but because its relevance had quietly dissolved. The assumptions that sustained it no longer aligned with what had just been witnessed. Someone shifted in their chair, as if preparing to speak, then reconsidered. Another reached for a notebook, then closed it without writing anything down. The language they had relied on was suddenly insufficient. Bruce Lee remained where he was, neither central nor withdrawn. He did not monitor the room for reaction. He did not offer clarification. His presence suggested that nothing further was required. This restraint was decisive. Had he explained himself, the room might have recovered its footing. It might have re-entered analysis, debate, interpretation. By withholding explanation, he allowed the silence to complete its work. The psychological shift was unmistakable. Doubt did not collapse dramatically. It faded. It lost momentum. Without confrontation to push against, it had nowhere to go. What remained was not agreement, but acceptance. The room began to reorganize itself around a new understanding, though no one articulated it. Authority shifted, not toward Bruce Lee as an individual, but away from the assumptions that had governed the discussion. When conversation eventually resumed, it did so cautiously, on different ground. The tone was slower. Claims were framed more tentatively. Certainty had been replaced by consideration. Bruce Lee did not rejoin the discussion. He gathered his things quietly, his movements unremarkable. When he stood to leave, no one stopped him. No one thanked him publicly. No one asked him to stay. Yet several people watched as he exited, not with curiosity, with recognition. The debate had ended without resolution, without winners or concessions. It had simply reached a point where it could not continue in its previous form, and Bruce Lee, by refusing to claim that moment, ensured that its effect would last far longer than any argument ever could. The moment was not recorded. There was no transcript, no official note taken, no photograph meant to preserve it. In the days that followed, it was rarely mentioned. When it was, it appeared only as a passing reference, something that had happened, then moved aside to make room for other work. Life continued. Projects were completed. Meetings followed meetings. New discussions replaced old ones. On the surface, nothing had changed. And yet, for those who had been in the room, something remained unsettled, in a way that did not demand attention, but refused to disappear. Years later, when the subject of Bruce Lee came up, the conversation often began elsewhere, with his films, his speed, his influence on martial arts culture. Only occasionally did someone pause, hesitate, and recall that earlier moment. They struggled to describe it, not because it was complex, but because it had been too simple. There was no decisive gesture to point to, no technique to name, no clear boundary where cause met effect. What lingered was the memory of certainty dissolving without resistance. Some of them would later recognize similar moments in their own fields, instances where established frameworks failed quietly without protest. They began to notice how often authority relied on repetition rather than understanding, how frequently doubt survived simply because it was never properly addressed. That room became a reference point, not spoken of as an event, but as a sensation. The feeling of realizing that a question had been answered without being argued, that proof had been offered without being displayed. Bruce Lee never revisited the incident. He did not incorporate it into teaching anecdotes. He did not frame it as validation of his ideas. To him, it had not been a moment of triumph. It had been a response, appropriate, sufficient, and finished. What endured was not what he did. It was what he refused to do afterward. He did not capitalize on silence. He did not claim authority from it. He allowed others to arrive at their own understanding in their own time. That choice gave the moment its longevity. Long after the details blurred, the lesson remained intact, not as instruction, but as memory. A reminder that the most decisive actions often announce nothing, that mastery does not insist on recognition, that some debates end not because one side wins, but because the question itself no longer holds. For those who witnessed it, the silence that followed Bruce Lee that day became something they carried forward, not loudly, not confidently, but carefully. And in that care, the debate never truly returned.